In the heart of the most powerful nation on earth, a group of men armed with nothing but box cutters and plane tickets managed to paralyze everything: airports, borders, stock markets, logic. The world held its breath while smoke replaced a skyline. And sure, we know the official story: hijackers, Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden in a cave. For instance, the fact that a Predator drone had Osama bin Laden in its sights multiple times in 2000 and early 2001, but no one pulled the trigger. Why? Because the CIA and Pentagon were still arguing over whether unmanned drones could legally be used to assassinate targets, or that the intelligence community had flagged the phrase "something very big is going to happen" multiple times and intercepted chatter before the attack. Yet, it got buried in noise. The system was flooded with might-be threats, so the real one got tossed in the pile. The man who ran the counterterrorism unit at the White House, Richard Clarke, had been begging for a meeting with the president to talk about a potential Al Qaeda attack for months. When he finally got it, it lasted 10 minutes. That's less time than most people spend deciding on a Netflix movie. Then there's the story of the hijacker who almost didn't get on the plane. One of them, Mohammed Atta, was held up at airport security in Portland, Maine, and nearly missed his connecting flight. A single missed alarm clock, and that day might have looked very different, or maybe even gone completely unnoticed by history. On the morning of 9/11, NORAD was actually running a simulation of a plane crashing into a building. The radar operators were literally asking, is this real or part of the exercise? Imagine playing a fire drill during a real fire, and no one tells you the difference. Now let's talk about Building 7. It wasn't hit by a plane, yet it collapsed. Symmetrically, fast, like a controlled demolition. Officials say it was due to structural damage and fires. Engineers still argue about it. Conspiracy theorists thrive on it. But the fact remains, it fell, and most people didn't even know a third tower existed. Then there's the matter of the stock market. In the days leading up to the attacks, there was an unusual surge in put options on airline stocks. Basically, a lot of people were betting that airline shares would plummet, which they did. But the question remains, who knew what and when? And how did so many financial watchdogs blink at the same time? And we haven't even touched on the passports. One of the hijackers' passports, paper, not electronic, was found intact in the rubble. Intact. From an explosion that incinerated steel beams. How a small booklet survived a fireball that brought down a skyscraper is either miraculous or convenient. But maybe the most surreal part of 9/11 is what came after. The Patriot Act passed within weeks. Hundreds of pages of legal changes drafted and ready to go, like someone had it sitting in a drawer labeled "just in case." Surveillance expanded. Wars began. Some of them still haven't ended. Of course, hindsight is a sharp weapon. There's a photo taken hours after the towers fell. A firefighter covered in dust sitting on a curb with a coffee. He looks exhausted, not shocked, not angry, just empty. And somehow that image says more than any speech ever could. Because once the dust settled, we didn't just lose buildings. We lost a kind of innocence, a belief that home was safe. And maybe that's the real story behind 9/11. But the moment millions of people realized that chaos wasn't just something that happened in faraway places, it could show up on a Tuesday morning. The fleet of planes was scrambled late. Orders to shoot down hijacked aircraft were given verbally, not written, not documented, just spoken words in a high-pressure room. And even then, no pilot actually received them in time. The military, for all its power, was flying blind. President Bush sat in a classroom reading the pet goat to second graders when the second plane hit. The look on his face wasn't confusion, it was calculation. Not because he knew anything, but because everyone was suddenly looking at him to know everything. And then came speeches. They hate our freedom. A sentence so elegantly simple that it made the world black and white again. Heroes and villains. Us and them. The ashes were still hot when the first whispers of Iraq began. Not Afghanistan, Iraq. A country that had nothing to do with it, no proven links, but an old grudge and oil reserves that whispered louder than facts. WMDs became the new three letters of fear, and just like that, the world tilted further off center. Ordinary Muslims were suddenly dangerous by default. Airports became suspicion zones. Fear grew roots. At Ground Zero, recovery workers breathed in toxic air for weeks, told it was safe. It wasn't. Years later, cancer rates would spike, lungs would scar, bodies would betray those who rushed in to help. But stories like that don't get headlines, they get footnotes. And if you follow the money, you find insurance payouts bigger than some national GDPs. Larry Silverstein, the leaseholder of the Twin Towers, had doubled his insurance coverage, specifically including terrorist attacks, just weeks before the event. Meanwhile, the FAA deleted records, tapes were destroyed. Mistakes were edited out of history like scratches on an old film reel, not because of a grand conspiracy, but because institutions don't like to look incompetent. But those were real people on Flight 93, calling loved ones, whispering goodbyes. And when the plane crashed in that Pennsylvania field, the world gained something rare, a moment of collective honor in the middle of overwhelming fear. Yet 20 years later, when you ask someone about 9/11, you get silence. Not because they've forgotten, but because they haven't. Some see it as the end of American invincibility, one that spies on itself, questions its own, and builds security around a paranoia that never really leaves. And somehow, 2 decades later, we're still scanning shoes at airports, still removing belts, still pretending that confiscating water bottles keeps us safe. Or maybe it's just what happens when fear becomes a system. Children born after September 11th can now vote. They study it like it's mythology, like the fall of Troy or the burning of Rome. And maybe that's fitting because 9/11 wasn't just an attack, it was a narrative reset, a new beginning written in smoke. Like the firefighter who retired the day before, the dog that refused to go to work that morning, the man who missed his train, the woman who stopped for coffee and it never made it upstairs. Coincidences so small, they almost feel intentional. Or the ones who weren't supposed to be there but were. A janitor who saved people he didn't know, a stranger who held the elevator, a voice on the other end of a phone saying, "I'm with you," again and again until the line went silent. Choices. People who didn't plan to be heroic but were. People who made decisions in seconds that echoed for lifetimes. You don't need to believe in conspiracies to know that 9/11 didn't just happen to buildings, it happened to people. And through them, it happened to the rest of us. And somewhere, buried in dust, still in memory, is the uncomfortable truth. For one morning, the world made sense in its horror. Everyone understood the same thing at the same time, and we went back to arguing, forgetting, dividing, until the next siren, the next flame, the next excuse to start paying attention again. Because deep down, we know something. It never really ended. Like a military recruiter's desk in a high school hallway. Like a TSA agent snapping on latex gloves. Like a kid named Osama who had to change his name. Like background checks that ask where your grandparents were born. It's in the way we hesitate before saying certain names out loud, and how Muslim still has to be followed by, but not that kind of Muslim, and how patriotism became something you had to prove rather than feel. The victims, the fear, the unity, the anger, the war. or just the fact that everything after that day felt a little bit off. And maybe we forget not because we don't care, but because remembering comes with baggage and the quiet realization that even the biggest empires can bleed. Somewhere out there, someone's still coughing. And somewhere out there, someone still thinks about how fast everything fell. And that's where we'll leave it. Because maybe, like the event itself, the story doesn't really have an ending,